I mentioned yesterday at the end of the lecture, Fetterman could take no more, so he charges his soldiers into the valley, and as soon as he gets in position, Native Americans from all three sides swarm him. 2,000. 2,000. Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho. Now, I'm going to tell you, as I mentioned yesterday, where Fetterman's men fell. Okay, they fell in 3 different locations. Okay, location number 1 was towards the front of the battle. This would be considered the front of the battle because they came from here. And we had 5 men killed in location 1. 3 were enlisted infantrymen, and 2 were civilians. 3 were enlisted infantrymen, and 2 were civilians. And the civilians were James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher. James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher. How do we know that? How do we know that those 2 guys were civilians? How do we know they fell there? Because necessarily things didn't stay. History wasn't recorded. So how do historians know? No white survivors, right? So how do historians know that James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher fell there? Other than the fact their bodies might have been there, but they might not have been. How do we know they fell there? Anybody have any idea how you would research that when no one survives? No? We have the Indian account. You know what they found in this area here? Several Henry's rifle repeating cartridges that were ejected out of the rifle. The only 2 men carrying Henry's repeating rifles were Wheatley and Fisher. They were not government-issued equipment. The rest of the soldiers would have had carbines. They would not have had Henry's repeating rifles. Since they were civilians, they owned their own rifles, and as they did the archaeological study of the Fetterman battlefield, they found buried multiple Henry's rifle cartridges in that area. Do you have any? No, I wish I did. Now, I'm guessing in Josh's behalf there that if they would allow you, you probably could go in there with metal detectors and find all kinds of things. They just don't allow you to do that. And some of it's already been, combed, but I'm sure there's some in there. Pretty cool. Now, the second area in which soldiers were killed were in this area here, area 2. And you know who was killed in that area? All 27 cavalrymen. And they were under the command of one of the 3 officers, Lieutenant George W. Grummond. So Lieutenant George W. Grummond and the 27 cavalrymen were all found dead in this area. How come they were farther down? The historians think they were all of them were in this area. Why all of a sudden are they down several hundred yards up? Because they had horses. And when they were trying to get out of there, they had their horses, and they only made it to that point there. That left Captain Fetterman and the remaining infantrymen, who were disposed of about a half a mile from the cavalry, more in the middle of the valley. Okay, they're about a half a mile from the cavalry. So my guess is, and nobody knows for sure, is they came off the ridge here, the cavalry and the 2 civilians, and I don't know what the 3 enlisted guys were maybe doing, I don't know. They end up in this area here, Fetterman's in the middle, they attack, these guys retreat a little bit back up into there, and that's kind of where they end up. The cool thing about this is when you get to Fort Phil Kearny, you'll see this. And you'll see down in this area there's 2 rocks in which someone has carved the names Wheatley and Fisher in the rocks where they fell. And right next to those rocks, on a side note, you can see the wagon wheel tracks of the Bozeman Trail. It's pretty cool. It's really pretty cool. But anyway, that's the story. So, at 12 noon, remember they were here at 11:45, right? At 12 noon, soldiers that were guarding the gates of Fort Phil Kearny reported that they heard firing from beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. So soldiers who were guarding the gates of Fort Phil Kearny reported that they heard firing from beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Who did they report that to? Colonel Carrington, very good. And he had a little lookout tower above his headquarters, and he climbed to the top of his lookout tower to see if he could see what was going on, and obviously it wasn't high enough and he could not. But he did say that the firing was continuous and rapid. He could hear it. So at 12 noon, the guards at the gates of Fort Phil Kearny informed Colonel Carrington that they hear firing from beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Carrington immediately goes up to the lookout tower above his headquarters. He cannot see anything, but he makes the statement that the firing is continuous and rapid. Carrington then comes down from his lookout tower and he orders Captain Tenador Tenike and 76 men to move out to Fetterman's relief, to relieve him, to try to assist him in his engagement of the hostiles. He has no idea, kids, there are 2,000 warriors against 83. He has no idea, okay? But he hears the firing, and so he orders Captain Tenador Tenike and 76 more men to go to Fetterman's relief. Makes sense, doesn't it? So, at 12:45, 1 hour after Fetterman originally reached the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, here is Tenador Tenike and his 76 men in the same spot looking over Lodge Trail Ridge into the valley. So an hour after Fetterman reached there, Tenador Tenike and his 76 soldiers have reached the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge. And they look over the ridge, Sully, my dear, and what do they see? They don't see any men slaughtered. All they see, that's what most kids say, is 2,000 Indians celebrating and encouraging Tenike and his soldiers to come on over, baby, we'll kill you too. And Tenike does not take the bait. He stands fast, glassing the area, seeing absolutely no soldiers from Fetterman's command. He sees none. But he stands fast. He's smart enough to stand fast because he's not going into that valley until when? He is assured that every one of those Native Americans, which is typical of them strategically, leaves the area. Normally they would not come back. They would try to get you to come over, and if you were patient enough, they would leave and go about their business. Well, finally, after waiting a period of time, the Indians withdraw from the valley. Sully, then what does he see? All of the men. There were so many Native Americans in the valley, he couldn't even see the dead men laying on the ground. Once they left, he could see them all laying on the ground. And the battle had lasted less than 45 minutes, no survivors. The battle had lasted about 45 minutes, no survivors. The only thing from Fetterman's command that was alive was a dog that belonged to one of the members of the command. Only thing that survived the battle was a dog. Now this is according to Indian folklore. What's folklore? Fable, who knows? One warrior, you have to write this down, one warrior proclaimed, quote, "Let the dog go back and tell the soldiers what will happen to them if they attack the Sioux." One warrior supposedly said, "Let the dog go back and tell the soldiers what will happen to them if they attack the Sioux." Unfortunately for the dog, many warriors wished that nothing remain alive after the battle, and the dog was killed. So there were no survivors. when you think about it. Actually, there was a survivor who was later killed. Does that make sense? Well, as I mentioned, Captain Tenike maintained his position on high ground until the Indian forces had vanished. He then cautiously advanced towards the battlefield. He and his men witnessed the dead men laying naked and mutilated, blood frozen in their wounds, because it was December 21st of 1866. So when Tenike and his men, 76 men, lower themselves into the valley, they witnessed a horrible sight, dead men laying naked and mutilated, blood frozen in their wounds. Now, Fetterman's men in position 3, kiddos, they all lay about 40 feet, all in the same 40-foot diameter spot, which tells you what? They just hunkered down, hoping to stay together to survive, and they were all killed. How would they know that? Because the bodies were there, and then later shell casings were found that would indicate that they were in a circular area in a 40-foot diameter. Nobody took time to write this down at the time, right? Yeah. There are a few, not a lot, but not too many. Now, Tenike and his soldiers began loading the dead soldiers into his ammunition wagon, but darkness was coming, and they certainly did not want to be there in the dark, and so after it started to reach dark, they went back to the fort. So Captain Tenike and his men loaded up as many dead as they could in their ammunition wagon until it got to the point where it was starting to get dark. They did not want to be there in the dark, and so they headed back to Fort Phil Kearny, which means that what's going to have to happen the next day? Somebody's going to have to go back and get the rest. Well, now I want you to think about this. They get back to the fort with these dead soldiers. There's still some in the field. Charles, what would you be thinking if you were Colonel Carrington? What would be your next course of action, knowing his philosophy of life, of command? What would be your concern?
The people go get the bodies and then sail again.
What about before that? What might be your concern? They just wiped out 83 of your men and feel pretty saucy, feel pretty good about themselves. What might they do? They might attack the fort. That was his fear. And so what did he think he needed? What would you think you might need after you lost 83 men? More men, right? So what he does on that dark, cold evening of December 21st, he sent for a soldier by the name of John Portugee Phillips. Carrington sends for a soldier by the name of John Portugee Phillips. What do you think he had Phillips do? Very good, my dear. Take a message or a dispatch to department headquarters at Fort Laramie. Tell them about the defeat they had just faced and ask for immediate reinforcements. So John Portugee Phillips was ordered by Colonel Carrington to deliver a dispatch or message back to department headquarters at Fort Laramie. Quite a ways away, isn't it? Sheridan to Laramie. Okay. The message would tell department headquarters about the Fetterman defeat and also a request for immediate reinforcements. Now Phillips left with 2 other soldiers, traveling 196 miles, mostly in blizzard conditions. So Phillips leaves with 2 other soldiers. The 3 men travel 196 miles toward Fort Laramie, mostly in blizzard conditions. The other 2 soldiers stopped 40 miles from Laramie. Phillips assured them he could take the message from there on his own. So John Portugee Phillips travels the lone 40 miles himself and delivers the message personally at Fort Laramie. He arrives on December 26th. Takes him 5 days. And he has traveled 236 miles total. So Phillips travels alone the remaining 40 miles to Fort Laramie. He delivers that dispatch or message personally. He arrived on December 26th, 5 days later, after completing a 236-mile journey in the middle of the winter. What would you compare that to as far as Western U.S. history? What famous ride might you compare that to? That happened early in our country.
Pony Express.
No?
British.
Okay, Paul Revere, but we like to say that Sybil Luddington was probably more famous, but you would compare it, they compare it to the historic ride of Paul Revere, which I still think is bogus in comparison to that of Sybil Luddington. Because Revere didn't even get to his place of destination. Yeah, but anyway, in Western U.S. history, the ride of Phillips from Fort Phil Kearny to Fort Laramie has achieved a status equal to that of Paul Revere's famous ride. Well, the following morning, what happens? Back at Fort Phil Kearny, because we've been traveling now with Phillips for 5 days. What happens the next morning on December 22nd at Fort Phil Kearny? What does Carrington do? He goes out and leads the second party of the battlefield to do what? Pick up what? The remaining bodies. So the next morning, Colonel Carrington leads himself the patrol that will go back to the battle site and recover the remaining bodies. They were recovered. All the deceased from the battle were buried in a makeshift cemetery just below Pilot's Knob.
That's still there.
No, that's a good question. I'm going to get that. That's very good. The cemetery's still there. The bodies are not. The remaining bodies were recovered, and all deceased from the battle were buried in a makeshift cemetery just below Pilot's Knob. What time of the year is this? They had to build fires to warm the ground before they could dig the graves. So you can imagine these graves were not your standard 6 feet deep, looking good, stay there forever type graves, right? So the burial detail had to build the fires to warm the ground before they could dig the graves. And they actually buried the soldiers 2 to a box, officers 1 to a box. So the soldiers, enlisted soldiers and cavalrymen, 2 to a box. Your officers, 1 to a box. Now I'm going to answer Andy's question. In 1890, 66, 76, 86, 24 years later, all the soldiers that were killed at the Fetterman fight were exhumed from the cemetery at Fort Phil Kearny, and they are presently all reburied at Custer Battlefield National Cemetery. So in 1890, all soldiers killed at the Fetterman fight were exhumed from the cemetery at Fort Phil Kearny and reburied at the Custer National Cemetery in Montana. Now we go there in May, you'll see the area in which the cemetery was. Again, like I say, you have to kind of envision this all yourself, right? And you'll see that cemetery area. Now, answering Emily's question. During the Fetterman fight, most of the Indians that were killed in the battle were a result of friendly fire. Because they were on all 3 sides of the ridge, and when they were firing across, a lot of them hit themselves. Okay? So Indians were lined up on both sides of the ridge shooting at the soldiers, and as a result, the Indians shot over the ridges, actually hitting each other, causing casualties. Now, tell you a little bit interesting. I think you'll like this. Historians who have studied this estimate that over 40,000 arrows were shot in that 45-minute period. After doing some research and study, historians estimate that approximately 40,000 arrows were shot in the 45-minute battle. That's about 1,000 a minute, isn't it? Pretty incredible. Think about your 83 men in that valley facing that. So most of the weaponry was bow and arrow. However, because of knowing what type of guns the soldiers had and knowing what type of guns the civilians had, because of finding lost cartridges or expended cartridges, they also estimate they thought that the Indians used approximately 38 guns in the battle. They had access to 38. How would you know that? Because there were 38 different types of cartridges found that were not compatible to what the civilians or the Army had. The point I'm making here is that's how you figure this kind of stuff out. So they found cartridges from 38 different rifles there, which gives you an indication that that many rifles were used by the Indians, because the white soldiers and civilians didn't have them. The only other defeat for the U.S. Army that will be worse in our American history than the Fetterman fight will be the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So the Fetterman fight ranks as the second biggest butt kicking, so to speak, that the U.S. Army's ever suffered. Second only to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Okay, we'll tell you about the aftermath of the Fetterman fight. Okay, what happened after that? Now, as Charles said, I believe, what was the expectation that night? What was Colonel Carrington's biggest fear? That the Indians would attack the fort. So after the Fetterman fight, it was expected the Indians would attack the fort and try to run it over. Now, obviously, the fort had lost a significant number of soldiers needed to protect that, 83. That's a lot of soldiers when you only have 450, right? So, because of the fear, all of the women and children at the fort were ordered to go to the powder magazine, which was in the center of the fort, not far from the flagpole. All the women and children were ordered to go to the powder magazine, which was located in the center of the grounds. And they took wagons and they made makeshift corrals around the powder magazine to protect the women and children. They took the boxes off the wagons and circled them around the powder magazine to provide protection for those women and children if the walls of Fort Phil Kearny were breached. What do you think, Emily, was going to happen if the hostiles got over the walls and began to kill all the soldiers and headed towards the powder magazine to do away with the women and children? What was the plan on the part of Fort Phil Kearny? Blow it up. Because the fate of blowing up in a powder magazine would have been much better than being a woman or child and